Um, so unlike the other researchers here, most of the other ones, I was saying my lab was at home, and I only had one participant in this little trial. And I know that many of you know this story already, so I'm actually going to talk about part 2 of the story a lot more, and some other things that I've learned about Alzheimer's disease. And okay, now I'm getting feedback. I basically stumbled upon the idea of ketones as an alternative fuel completely by accident. It was a happy accident. It actually ended up buying my husband several more extra good years that were better than the year before. All of that happened. And okay. I know when I get too close to it, I'm getting feedback. Is that better? Okay, sorry. Yeah, what I was saying was that as a result of stumbling over information about ketones as alternative fuel for the brain, Steve ended up gaining several extra good years that were better than the year before we found this information. I'm going to tell you this part of the story fairly briefly. Steve was very well aware that he had Alzheimer's disease. He knew what he could do before and what he couldn't do now, and he was a very willing and eager participant. He was a very compliant patient. He trusted me, and he would do whatever I suggested to him to try to fight this disease. He wanted to fight it, and he wanted to beat it. And as you heard, he ultimately did lose this battle, but again, he did, I think, gain several extra good years. So Steve was an accountant. He worked from my home. He took care of our children at home. He worked for my medical practice. And when he was age 51, he started having very significant memory kind of problems, and it became obvious that something was truly wrong when he couldn't remember if he'd been to the bank and the post office. But by 2008, he was on a downward spiral. This is about 7 years into having symptoms, and he even had a lot of problems, with memory, being able to do things, is how he put it. Couldn't remember mid-sentence what he was trying to talk about. That was a very common problem. And he also had physical symptoms. He had a tremor, and he had a slow, weird gait that wasn't real typical for Alzheimer's at that stage. Later, we learned he participated in the Florida Brain Bank study, which is a study of Alzheimer's and other dementias. And he donated his brain at a point where, he decided to donate it at a point where he could decide such things. And we found out that his main pathology was Alzheimer's disease, but he also had Lewy body dementia throughout the limbic system, Lewy bodies throughout the limbic system, which is what occur in Parkinson's disease. And the tremors and the slow gait and things like that were most likely related more to the Lewy bodies. So Steve was, we were trying to get him into clinical trials, and there were 2 screenings for 2 different drugs that were scheduled on 2 subsequent days. And the night before, I thought, I'm going to get on the internet and look at the risks and the benefits of these 2 different drugs, just in case he's accepted into both studies, so we can try to decide which one to choose. And just completely by accident, I happened on a press release about medical food that was being tested. They were aiming towards FDA recognition. We're still about a year away, as it turned out, from that. And they claimed that their studies showed that their medical food improved the memory and cognition of nearly half of the Alzheimer's patients that took it. Well, that's not something you hear at all about Alzheimer's drugs. They might slow it down for 6 months or so. So I had to dig further, and I found a patent application for AC1202, which turned out to be medium-chain triglycerides. And I think most people in the room here know that when you consume medium-chain triglycerides, your liver converts at least part of it to ketone bodies. So this was a completely new subject to me. I hadn't heard anything about this. Basically I learned through reading in their patent application that it's a type of, that Alzheimer's is a type of diabetes of the brain that they call type 3 diabetes, and they named it that because they had studied the brains of people that died with Alzheimer's that did not have type 1 or type 2 diabetes, and they found that insulin resistance and insulin deficiency is present very early, in the earliest stages of Alzheimer's, and that it worsens and progresses throughout the brain in the later stages. So this group who coined the term type 3 diabetes suggested that long-acting insulin or some other treatments for type 2 diabetes might work for Alzheimer's disease. And very recently, this was published showing that when intranasal insulin was used at 40 units, that there was some improvement in memory and verbal and visuospatial work. However, they saw no differences in daily functioning or executive functioning. So that's still a work in progress. But basically what's going on is it's a fundamental problem of trying to get the glucose into the brain. And part of it is the insulin resistance and insulin deficiency, but also PDH complex deficiency. There's deficiencies of GLUT1, which transports glucose past the blood-brain barrier, and deficiencies of GLUT3 that transports glucose into neurons. And Dr. Cunane talked about this earlier, but there are areas of decreased glucose uptake in the brain. These blue areas are areas where there's very poor glucose uptake compared to this brain, this normal brain here. So, and then it was also mentioned today that FDG PET studies have shown that people who are at risk for Alzheimer's disease already in their 30s, and I found another study even in their 20s, already have decreased glucose uptake in the brain. So this is a problem that you can see it on imaging studies decades potentially before someone actually develops symptoms of the disease. So as I'm reading through this patent application, the question became, could ketones bypass the fundamental problem of getting glucose into the brain by providing alternative fuel in Alzheimer's disease? And this is the what was learned about starvation back in the late 1960s, published from Dr. George Cahill's lab, showing that over time, ketones basically start at minimal levels. When a person is not fasting, especially on a normal, typical American diet, which is higher in carbohydrate, and acetoacetate increases, but beta-hydroxybutyrate over time, 10-20 days, becomes extraordinarily high, and ultimately it can provide up to 60% of the fuel to the brain, of the brain's fuel energy requirement. So this is just a very simple scheme of what's going on. Here's the problem of glucose not being able to enter the TCA cycle, but ketones can bypass a number of chemical reactions to ultimately make acetyl-CoA, which enters the TCA cycle to produce ATP, which is needed for normal functioning of every cell in the body, basically. And there's the scientific version of that. Another thing I learned in the patent application was the work of Dr. Richard Veitch. In 2000, he published his study in which they had created models of using neurons of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, toxins that cause those particular disease. And some cultures had the ketone beta-hydroxybutyrate in the mix, and other cultures did not. And they found that there were many more surviving neurons in the cultures that contain beta-hydroxybutyrate. He's actually been working on ketone ester since the mid-1990s after studying and realizing that there was potential for ketones as alternative fuel to help potentially many different conditions. So right around 2000 also, Samuel Henderson filed the first patent application for the medical food that I had come across, AC1202, and he had the brilliant insight that the mild ketosis produced by the conversion of medium-chain triglycerides to ketones in the liver might be adequate to produce cognitive improvement in the Alzheimer brain. So that was the basis of his idea. And that just shows, what happens with MCT oil, which is extracted from coconut oil. Coconut oil is about 60% medium-chain triglycerides if you consider those C6 through C12 carbon chains. And it rang a bell with me because I'm a neonatologist. Back in the late 70s, early 80s, we used to feed our very tiny preemies, had great difficulty growing, and we would give them MCT. We would add it to each of their feedings. It was very easily absorbed. It helped them gain weight, and ultimately MCT was added to infant formulas, especially premature formulas now contain MCT. And MCTs are present in human breast milk, about 10 to 17% of the fats in human breast milk, which is why coconut oil and MCT are included in the infant formulas. So we heard from Dr. Cunnane today, who basically the gist of it was that the glucose uptake, he confirmed that glucose uptake is decreased in the Alzheimer's brain, but ketone uptake is normal throughout the brain, including the areas affected by Alzheimer's. And this is strong supporting evidence, that ketones might, could provide alternative fuel for the brain and potentially help people with Alzheimer's. And now he presented his other study with MCT, preliminary results that look promising. So this is Steve, and he was screening for the 2 clinical trials, and I'm reading about this the night before the first screening and didn't have time to do anything about it. So we went for the screening. He needed to score 16 out of 30 on the mini mental status exam, and he scored only 14 points. And we were devastated. Needless to say, it seemed like our last hope to get him into a clinical trial. And he was asked to draw a clock. Clock test is very specific for Alzheimer's, and you can see it's just a few random circles and a few numbers. And I was pulled aside by the doctor who told me he was on the verge of severe Alzheimer's. So I thought, since I didn't know MCT oil was available over the counter, but I did know coconut oil was, so we went to get coconut oil. I researched everything I could about reminding myself the medium chain triglycerides and what the fatty acid composition of coconut oil was, and was able to figure out that to give him 20 grams of medium chain triglycerides, which were used in the medical food trials, that it would require about 35 grams of coconut oil. It was a little flawed. They were using C8, I was counting C6 through C12, but nonetheless. So the next day, he got 35 grams of coconut oil. He scored 4 points higher, 18 out of 30, on the mini mental status exam, and he qualified for the trial. So at that point, it was it just really good luck, or was it really the coconut oil? So I kept it going, and routinely gave him 35 grams in the morning, and just started cooking with it throughout the day, and ultimately he ended up getting measured doses of it at dinner, and then at lunch, and then eventually before bedtime. And my thinking, and we started adding MCT oil to it. Dr. Richard Veach had suggested that, once I learned that I could get C8 and I could get MCT oil, because I'll show you his levels in a little bit, but the MCT oil ketone levels in the plasma measured higher than what we were seeing with coconut oil. So it made sense he wanted me to completely switch to MCT oil, but I'm like, he improved with coconut oil. I'm not going to take a chance. There might be something else about it. So ultimately he got up to, he was taking 9 to 11 tablespoons a day. It took months to get up to that level, but he effectively had put him on a ketogenic diet just by virtue of the sheer amount of fat that was in his diet. And he just naturally put aside bread and rice and pasta, and basically I just stopped putting it on his plate, and he ended up on a ketogenic type of diet. So this was his clock the day before starting coconut oil. This is at 2 weeks, considerably more complex, and I think the little spokes that are all over the place are hands of the clock, or he was trying to line up the numbers across from each other. And then that's about 37 days. So it's cleaned up, considerably more like a clock than on the day before. And there they are together. And we just saw a lot of other improvements. Almost right away, the animation came back in his face, and his sense of humor came back. He had physical symptoms, tremors, stiff gait that resolved over time. He had a visual disturbance. He said the words would jump around on the page and he couldn't read, and that resolved after 3 or 4 months. He was able to resume doing things, yard work and housework, and then after 6 months or so, he was able, it was probably a little more than 6, maybe 9 months, he he was doing so well, he was able to volunteer in the hospital. He worked in the warehouse. He put prices on, on the supplies and that type of thing, or labels. And that was really amazing compared to where he was before we started this. He did get into one of the clinical trials. He actually could have gone to either one, and we chose one with semaglutide. And we didn't know until later that he was on the placebo during the first 12 to 14 months. So he had a lot of testing. And so, you know, when he was in it, we didn't know for sure, was it coconut oil or was it the drug? Well, he was on placebo. So we eventually knew that it was coconut oil. And he gained on the Alzheimer's Disease Assessment Scale Cognitive 6 out of 75 points during that year, and gained 14 out of 78 points on the Activities of Daily Living test, which is quite the opposite of what other people on placebo did in that study. I have a video here I want to show you. I think Bill Curtis is in the room here, I believe. Yeah, there he is. And Bill has Parkinson's disease. And this is his reaction to, he used a bulletproof type of coffee concoction that had Kerrygold butter, which has some medium chain triglycerides in it, coconut oil, and cream, which also has some medium chains, and stevia. And this is before taking this, and then the second part of the video is after. No, it's on. I can hear it. It just needs to be louder, I think. You can see that he starts to tremor his hands as he's playing the guitar. That's probably one of the most common symptoms of Parkinson's disease that's obvious.
So much for the guitar.
So he goes away, takes his bulletproof coffee. And finishes the song. Bill, do you remember about how long after you took the coffee that you were able to finish the song? Do you remember?
Well, when I take the coffee, it takes about an hour or so.
How many? I'm sorry.
1 hour.
1 hour. So very interesting. So now there are other case reports popping up, and some smaller studies looking at the effects of MCT in Alzheimer's, mild cognitive impairment, brittle diabetes that was mentioned earlier, people that have hypoglycemic episodes, showing that it appears to be protective when someone becomes severely hypoglycemic. And getting back to Steve's levels of ketones. So Dr. Veach, I contacted him, fairly early on after Steve improved, and I didn't tell him what I was doing, and I said, theoretically, if somebody took coconut oil, do you think they could, someone with Alzheimer's? And he said, no, the ketone levels need to be 5 millimole. He said, there's no way that would happen. Well, I already knew that something had happened, but after he drew the second clock, I faxed to Dr. Veach with the first clock. He called me back, and he was amazed and very interested, and started sending me articles and putting me in touch with people to talk about this. And about 2 months after, he said, let's see what kind of levels we get of ketones. And so basically, we went to the hospital that I worked at, and the lab very kindly took samples of him after he had a morning dose. This was 35 grams of coconut oil, and then Dr. Veach said, let's do an evening dose too and see what happens. So he had another dose here. And these are not very high levels. And this is actually acetoacetate here, and this is beta-hydroxybutyrate. You'll see in a minute, it's the exact opposite of what you get with MCT oil, C8. They're the reverse. And this is glucose, blood glucose, and you can see there was a dip, really after both doses in blood glucose. These are not very high levels. The highest we got, this is after dinner, was a total of about 0.35 millimoles of ketones. We don't know how high it got because we didn't know we should keep measuring it after that. And then this is with just pure C8. This was 20 grams of C8. And this is Steve here, and you can see this is the beta hydroxybutyrate. This is acetoacetate. And at 90 minutes, he peaked. And by 3 hours, the level was pretty much back down again. This was another doctor that worked with me who was on a diet. He'd been losing weight, and he was also had started taking MCT oil after Steve improved, and so he also got a bump a little bit later than Steve. So these are not extraordinarily high levels of ketones that we're getting from this intervention, but so the question then was, how could Steve improve so much with low ketone levels from coconut oil? And one thing that encouraged me at the time, Dr. Veach sent me an article by Dr. Johan van Cove, and he had studied 3 children with an enzyme deficiency, multiple acyl-CoA dehydrogenase deficiency that includes a problem with fatty acid beta oxidation. And the case report that he focused on was a 4-month-old child. The other 2 children were cousins of this child. And this child at 4 months old presented with hypotonia, very low muscle tone, enlarged liver, stridor, which is noisy breathing, had trouble swallowing, had the typical lab characteristics of MAD disease, and a normal brain MRI at that point was done. And they were using the traditional treatment for that for a period of time, but by 2 years it had stopped working. And over several weeks, the child lost the ability to walk and developed spastic quadriplegia with complete loss of the use of all 4 limbs and could no longer talk. So this child was started on sodium beta hydroxybutyrate. It's a ketone salt, basically. Every 4 hours, the dosage was increased slowly. And this is what caught my eye, that the levels were 0.19 to 0.36 millimoles. And I'm like, wow, that's what we were getting with coconut oil. And after 9 days of taking this, the child could move his arms after a month, lifted both arms. After 4 months, he had head control. He could use his arms to drink from a cup. At 6 months, he could sit with support and spoke words. 16 months, he was talking in shortened sentences, crawling, rode a tricycle. He still had some neurologic symptoms of his disease. At 19 months, he was able to walk independently. And his MRIs, so these are before the intervention, and very dense white matter. This is a very abnormal MRI. And it just kind of gradually clears out at 2 months and even more so at 9 months. A big change in this child's MRI. So the Newport Oilio company asked the same question. Since the ketone levels are very low with coconut oil, how could it bring about so much improvement? There might be another explanation. And so they just recently published their study in the Journal of Oleoscience, and they did 2 experiments that they reported. And the first was with 7-week-old Sprague Dolly rats that were fed coconut oil or high oleic sunflower that contains no medium-chain fatty acids, or MCT oil, and this was a mixture of C8 and C10. And they took blood samples immediately before and at 2 and 4 hours after the oil was gavaged into the stomach of the rats. They looked at total ketone body levels, total triglycerides, and total free fatty acids, as well as individual fatty acids that they measured. And this just shows you the breakdown of the medium chain fats. Again, sunflower oil, no medium chains. Coconut oil is predominantly C12, which is called lauric acid, and it's almost half of coconut oil. The traditional MCT oil really has a minuscule amount of C12 and is mostly C8 and C10. There's different formulations of MCT oils out there. And what they found was that MCT substantially and significantly increased the plasma total ketone body levels in the area under the curve compared to sunflower or coconut oil. They found no significant difference in the plasma total ketone body levels between coconut and sunflower oil. There was a slight bump, but not very much. And they found plasma triglycerides and free fatty acid levels were increased at 2 and 4 hours, as well as the area under the curve for sunflower, more than for coconut oil, but were decreased for MCT oil. So this shows the plasma lipids, the individual plasma lipids, and here C12, lauric acid, and the other medium chain triglycerides. And these were with equal amounts of the fat given, an equal amount of MCT and equal amount of lauric acid. Well, actually, I'm sorry, I've got that a little bit, I'm getting ahead of myself. So what they found was that after ingesting coconut oil, that lauric acid was greatly increased with coconut oil, not with MCT oil. So in the second experiment, they did in vitro cultures of KT5 astrocytes, which are mouse astrocytes, and they gave 50 and 100 microliters each in different cultures. Vehicle alone, vehicle plus C18, which is a oleic acid that contains no medium chains. Sorry. Vehicle plus caprylic acid, which is only C8, and vehicle plus lauric acid, which is only C12, and then measured the total ketone body levels after 4 hours. And what they found was that the difference in total ketone body levels between the vehicle and oleic acid was significant at 100 but not 50 microliters, and that the difference in total ketone bodies was significantly higher than the vehicle for lauric acid and for caprylic acid. So what's going on here is that in astrocytes, at least in culture, in vitro, ketogenesis is happening within the astrocyte when they are exposed to the medium chain triglycerides, C8 and C12. So potentially that could explain, if it's confirmed in human astrocytes, and we can show that lauric acid crosses the blood-brain barrier, that the ketogenesis may be taking place in the brain in astrocytes, and astrocytes are brain cells that nourish other neurons. So I think those will be the next steps to look at that, to try to confirm this in human astrocytes and in vivo. So in their discussion, they said that most of the C8 and C12 is absorbed by way of the portal vein to the liver and is oxidized in the liver without entering peripheral circulation, and therefore would be less likely to stimulate in vivo ketogenesis in astrocytes. Whereas lauric acid is only partially absorbed by the portal vein, but most of it enters the peripheral circulation, and it remains elevated much longer. At 4 hours, it was virtually the same level as it was at 2 hours after taking lauric acid, and stays in circulation much longer than C8 or C10 in the blood. So they believe that it's more likely that lauric acid produces in vivo ketogenesis in astrocytes than C8 or C10 would for those reasons. So they concluded that coconut oil intake markedly increases plasma free fatty acids and lauric acid C12 content, that lauric acid directly and potently stimulates ketone production in astrocytes in vitro and may provide nearby neurons with fuel. So I'm going on a little tangent here. It sounds like a tangent at first. One of the things I always, obviously wonder, why would Steve get Alzheimer's disease, and why would he get it so young? And one unusual thing that happened to Steve when he was 29, before that he was always fighting fever blisters, which are herpes simplex 1 virus. And when he was 29, he had an infection around his eye. He was very sick. He couldn't sit up. He couldn't eat. He was very nauseated. So I thought, I wonder if there could be any connection between Alzheimer's and herpes simplex. And lo and behold, all these studies popped up. And this was published very recently in 2016. And this is a group of investigators all through the USA, and Europe mainly. And the page actually went on to the next page of all of the people involved in this editorial. And these are groups that have been studying microbes, various microorganisms, and Alzheimer's disease. And for example, there are more than 100 studies of herpes simplex virus since 1991 and its possible connection with Alzheimer's. There are studies looking at several types of spirochetes. It's very well known that syphilis, which is a spirochete, causes dementia. And so Lyme's disease, somebody mentioned that earlier today. Chlamydia pneumoniae, fungi such as Candida, and just having an abnormal microbiota, been associated, but potentially connected with Alzheimer's disease. But yet the people that, the spokespeople for Alzheimer's disease still consider these ideas controversial. So the point of the editorial was to point out that there's a vast body of research that needs to be looked at and not ignored, because if you're dealing with an infection, there's potential to treat it. So I don't really have time to go through step by step the evidence for herpes simplex. This one was featured, the lead author, that's what she's been studying, and that's what I believe Steve had. But the most interesting thing about it to me is that Alzheimer's starts near the hippocampus, and so does herpes simplex encephalitis, and both travel through the limbic system. So Alzheimer's seems to spread much like an infection. So for me, I think there's a very strong possibility that that is what triggered Alzheimer's disease for my husband. So that was an aside. Another piece of evidence is that the role of beta amyloid. Beta amyloid is what makes up the plaques in Alzheimer's disease. And it's now been learned that A-beta, or beta amyloid, is an antimicrobial peptide. It has potent activity against multiple bacteria and yeast. It also has antiviral activity. There's also another antimicrobial peptide that's upregulated in the Alzheimer brain, B defensin 1. So could it be that people with Alzheimer's have so much plaque in their brain because as a response to infection? It's known that people with Alzheimer's have difficulty removing beta amyloid plaque from the brain. That's part of the problem, that it accumulates and isn't easily removed from the brain. So now we're back to lauric acid. Lauric acid is half of coconut oil. It's also prevalent in human breast milk. And when I was being trained in neonatology, I was told lauric acid is one of the substances in breast milk that helps the newborn fight infection. And I thought, wow, that's most interesting. Well, there's a huge body of work looking at lauric acid and infection, and capric acid, which is C10, also has been shown to have antimicrobial effects, but lauric acid basically has been shown to be antimicrobial to bacteria, viruses, fungi, and protozoa. It has several different mechanisms by which this can occur. It's even known to decrease dental plaque formation, which has to do with bacteria in the mouth. And there are many commercial uses for lauric acid and its metabolite monolaurin as antimicrobial agents. It's used to treat difficult microbial infections in animals such as dairy cows, poultry, and piglets. And there are more than 100 patents worldwide of the use of monolaurin as a microbicide or microbiostatic agent for food and non-food applications. So again, Steve, he had an immediate improvement within a few hours that I believe was probably alternative fuel, ketogenesis happening somewhere. And he had a long-term improvement, and we saw virtually no fever blisters during the next couple of years, as opposed to almost constant fever blisters, before he started taking coconut oil. And it could be that the lauric acid helped control that. So that's that part of the story. Now here's part 2 of Steve's story, ketone story, and it has to do with the ketone monoester. And I wasn't really at liberty to talk too much about it. It was an N of 1. It was provided by Dr. Beach at the NIH. But what happened was Steve was really doing very well. He improved a lot the first year, and he was fairly stable the second year. He got into the trial, semaglutide trial, and we know he was on placebo for 12 to 14 months. Well, at some point he crossed over to the drug. We think it was between August and October of 2009, and in February 2010 he started having a bunch of side effects. He had an abrasion on his shin that didn't heal for a month. He would nick himself shaving, it would bleed for several days, just all kinds of strange things. He fainted, which he had never done. He had a viral intestinal upper respiratory infection, again started breaking out in fever blisters, and wondered what's going on. But we decided to withdraw him from participation in the study. And that was a good thing, because we learned about 5 months after that they had stopped the study because it was found to have accelerated worsening of the disease. So the irony was that taking coconut oil had gotten him into the study, but now he was on a drug that potentially made his Alzheimer's worse. And so right around that time, we didn't know it, that possibly it was that drug that was causing the problem, but he had a big deterioration. He started doing things very common for Alzheimer's, like wandering away from home and talking to who we thought was his father in the mirror. It was himself. Had trouble finding his way around the house. Had to be talked through showering and shaving, step by step. It was all very sad. And so along, Dr. Veach came to our rescue, and we had kept in close contact, and toxicity testing had been completed with the ketone Ester. He didn't want to give it to anybody until that had been done. It was reported in 2012, but it was completed well before that. And he had also had done studies there using triple transgenic Alzheimer mouse model, and this is one that accumulates amyloid, abnormal tau protein, and as he put it, they're stupid. They have cognitive deficits. And they had used the ketone Ester with this mouse model and found compared to controls that it did reduce plaque and tangle and improve memory and learning. So Steve became, again, a clinical trial of one with the ketone Ester. And there's other evidence. This is a new study that Dr. Veach, he gave it to me on Monday. This was just published. More evidence that ketone bodies may help in Alzheimer's. I had rearranged my talk a little bit. That was really going to be at the end, but I'll tell you now. So as a preface to the study, this is a whole series of studies that were reported in one article. It was really quite amazing, the information here. But as a preface, they cited recent evidence that amyloid beta is absorbed into and is transported through distal axons, that it accumulates in mitochondria of cell bodies, that it's further transferred to nearby neurons, and that accumulation of particular types of A beta 142 causes mitochondrial dysfunction and failure by virtue of binding to mitochondrial proteins and increasing formation of ROS. Alzheimer's is associated also with mitochondrial dysfunction and oxidative stress. So they did a whole series of in vitro experiments on cortical neurons from newborn rats or mouse pups, and they showed that a mixture of ketones, it was an equal mixture of beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, prevented A beta 42 induced membrane dysfunction, neuronal injury, mitochondrial dysfunction, and ROS formation. They also showed that ketones reduced intracellular levels of A beta 42 by preventing perforation of the cell membrane by A beta 42. They also showed that ketones protected synaptic plasticity against A beta 42 toxicity. So they did an in vivo study that they reported as well, and these were APP mice, which are mice that accumulate amyloid in the brain, but they show synapse loss and learning deficits beginning at about 3 to 4 months of age, and increased accumulation of A beta plaques at about 6 months. So in this experiment, they compared the APP mice with wild-type mice, and they received daily subcutaneous injections, that means under the skin, of normal saline or beta hydroxybutyrate mixture that was I guess that it would be a 4-to-1 mixture of beta-hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate for 2 months. So they got daily injections of a ketone mixture beginning at 3 to 4 months of age for 2 months. And what they showed was that in this experiment that ketones improved mitochondrial dysfunction by restoring complex 1 activity and reducing soluble A-beta-42 levels. And they saw that ketones did not affect the wild-type mice, but they drastically improved the memory performance in the APP mice on the Morris water maze and novel object recognition. So considerable evidence there that ketones may very well have an impact on Alzheimer's disease. So this is the diagram of beta-hydroxybutyrate molecule. This is D-beta-hydroxybutyrate. And the Veach ester is a combination of D-beta-hydroxybutyrate with butanediol, which when it separates from beta-hydroxybutyrate further converts to more beta-hydroxybutyrate. It's kind of a neat idea. And there are 2 isoforms of it, D and L beta-hydroxybutyrate. You can think of it as mirror images. It's probably not exactly like that, but there's the D, the right-handed, and L, the left-handed. And Dr. Veach gave me this information, and he said that D-beta-hydroxybutyrate is the most predominant form in circulation, whereas the L form is mostly found inside the mitochondria. And he believes that they are metabolized somewhat differently, that the D form is metabolized by beta-hydroxybutyrate dehydrogenase, and that enzyme does not use the L form, and that the L form undergoes beta oxidation with less energy produced than the D form. So he feels that there could be metabolic differences in using the D versus the L. So we're in the scheme of things, the ketone esters can easily get levels that are close to what you see with with fasting or starvation, classic ketogenic diet. I'm going to skip that. Toxicity testing. Okay, so on April 29, 2010, so this is almost 2 years after he started coconut oil, but he was deteriorating. Steve started taking the ketone ester, and it was what we had come up with was a 25% solution. It was about 50% water, 25 grams, 25% the ketone ester, and 25% of something to make it palatable. And we tried many different things and ended up using SodaStream concentrate, which has a lot of sugar in it, which really didn't want to do that, but it's very hard to swallow. Tastes a little bit like jet fuel, so you're trying to disguise that. And the first time he took it, he received 22 grams of ester 3 times a day. Levels were drawn about 2 hours before the first dose, and then an hour after, and 4 hours after. Whoops, you can see that his level increased from about 0.1 millimoles to 1.4 at 4 hours, and then back down to 0.4, after 4 hours after the dose. And within 2 hours, we saw just some interesting changes already, where he had an improvement in his mood and affect. He was euphoric. That was one of the things that was actually, I thought it was interesting, was reported in the toxicity testing, that some people became euphoric when they took it, but Steve was euphoric. And he had not been able really to write at all for several months, and it took him 20 minutes, which in and of itself was amazing that he would persist for 20 minutes, but ultimately he said the entire alphabet, and he wrote it out after multiple attempts, wrote out the whole thing. And any 5-year-old can do that, but Steve couldn't, for a couple months. So he was extremely proud of that. He kept talking about it for quite a while after that. Within 24 hours, he was able to choose clothing and dress himself without prompting or assistance. And over a period of time, we basically increased his dose to about 85 grams a day, divided into 3 doses. And he continued to get varying amounts of coconut and MCT oil. I was just very reluctant to not include that, since he had improved so much with coconut oil in the beginning. And he resumed a lot of activities. Before that, I had to talk him through taking a shower and and shaving, step by step. And he was able to start doing things like that on his own, and even order from a menu at a restaurant. And he was no longer lost inside the house. Eventually, he stopped wandering outside of the house, and his thinking became more abstract, more insightful. His sense of humor came back again. And he said he felt good, he had more energy, he was happier, and he just found it easier to do things. That's how he put it, and that was my observation as well. So, we continued doing this, and he eventually improved in his longer-term memory, where he could remember things that would happen a week earlier and bring them up spontaneously, and was able to start doing yard work again and more complex kind of activities, so to speak. So these are some of the levels that we got with Steve. We were trying to figure out what was the right dose, and we were aiming for 4 to 5 millimoles. And so you can see, this is 25 grams, 35 grams, 50 grams. Obviously, the higher the dose, the higher the level we got. And at about an hour, they peaked. I mean, we got as high as 7 millimoles. So this is instant ketosis at its best. And you can see that the levels came down fairly quickly. By 3 to 4 hours, we're getting back down closer to baseline. So, one problem with the ketone ester is palatability, trying to find a way, to be able to drink it. Steve, no matter what we did, he shuddered every time he took it, but he was such a trooper that he took it. And sustain, trying to keep some kind of sustained release going on. So those are things that I hope will happen with the ketone ester. And basically, in summary, Steve experienced considerable reversal of his symptoms of Alzheimer's and had improved quality of life in many areas, first in response to medium-chain fatty acids, and then in response to ketone esters, which provide even higher, considerably higher levels of ketones to the brain. Dr. Veach believes he should have gotten, or ideally would have gotten, 150 grams of ketone ester. That's quite a lot. Ketone ester right now is very expensive to make, so it would have cost an extraordinary amount of money. We were just the very fortunate beneficiaries of that. And I just have one more video of Bill Curtis, and this is, he doesn't say in the video what it was, but he said he took something, and it was the beta-hydroxybutyrate ester. So this is the day, I think this is the day before when he didn't take it, and then then he's going to come back, and it's the day when he did take it.
2 hours and 15 minutes since I had my last medication. My medications are up to date. And this is normally when I start to develop off symptoms. So, thought I would. Also today, I haven't taken any BHB. It's Friday, July 31st, and I took my meds about 5:15, 3 hours 15 minutes ago, and I should be off by now, but I've been driving my beta-hydroxybutyrate levels up, so I took something that drove them up at the same time, and just wanted to do a few things so that you could see what my motor state was.
So there you have it. And Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are just two diseases that might respond to this. There are many other diseases that have a problem of insulin resistance and or decreased glucose uptake into cells. And that was coconut oil. I think I showed this last year in my grocery store in 2008, and this is the shelf in my grocery store now, 8 years later. Now it's 8 years later. So what do you have to lose? Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you.